The alarm didn't sound like danger. That was what unsettled Caliph the most. It was a soft chime, almost polite, blinking red on the panel beside his bed at 10 minutes past midnight. Perimeter breach, Sector 4, Canine Unit. Not an intruder, not a threat assessment, just 3 words that made his stomach drop faster than any gunfire ever had. Radar was gone. Caliph was out of bed before the second chime finished. Men in his position did not panic. He'd trained that out of himself years ago. Contracts, rivals, board members who smiled at him and plotted behind his back. None of it rattled him. But the dog was different. The dog didn't know what Caliph was. The dog had never once looked at him like he was a loaded weapon someone had forgotten to put the safety on. He pulled on a jacket, crossed the cold marble of his study, and pulled up the estate's security feed. 12 cameras, 4 guards on rotation, a perimeter fence wired with sensors that could detect a bird landing on it. And somehow, for the 3rd time this month, a 140-pound Doberman had slipped through all of it like smoke. "Show me the gate," Caliph said. The footage rewound itself on command. There it was, radar, moving low and fast along the tree line, ducking under a gap in the fence that the maintenance crew swore didn't exist. No hesitation, no confusion. The dog moved like he had somewhere specific to be. Caliph had raised Radar since he was 8 weeks old, training him himself in the evenings when the rest of the world thought he was reviewing shipping manifests. Radar was supposed to be unshakable, the kind of animal that guarded a man who'd made more enemies than friends. And yet here he was, breaking out of a fortress in the middle of the night. Again. Caliph didn't wake his security team. He wasn't ready for an audience. He grabbed the small satellite tracker from his desk drawer, the same model his company built for high-value cargo, clipped to Radar's collar since the second disappearance. A blinking dot pulsed on the screen, already 8 miles northeast and climbing. He took the SUV himself. The roads out of Zurich narrowed fast, curling up into the dark folds of the Bernese Oberland, past sleeping villages with their shutters closed. The higher he climbed, the thinner the road markings became, until there was no road at all, just a gravel track through pine forest, lit only by his headlights and the dot on the screen that refused to keep moving. He parked where the track ended and walked the rest, boots crunching over frost-hardened dirt, breath fogging in front of him. The cold here was sharper than the city, cleaner, the kind that made a man feel small and exposed. Caliph was not used to feeling either. Then he saw the light. A single cabin sat in a clearing ahead, wood-framed and half-buried in the tree line, with one window glowing amber against the black. Smoke curled from a narrow chimney. And there, sitting calmly on the porch steps as though he had lived there his whole life, was Radar, tail thumping lazily against the wood, tongue out, utterly relaxed. Beside him, kneeling with a wrench in one hand and adjusting the angle of a small satellite dish mounted on a tripod, was a woman Caliph had never seen before in his life. She didn't jump. She didn't reach for anything. She glanced up at him standing at the edge of her clearing, a stranger, unannounced, at midnight, in a place 8 miles from the nearest road, and she simply said, without a trace of alarm in her voice, "You must be the one he keeps escaping to see." Caliph stopped walking. "You know my dog's name," he said. It wasn't a question. He hadn't said it. He was certain of that. The woman, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, dressed for mountain work in a canvas jacket dusted with dirt, set down her wrench and gave Radar an absent scratch behind the ears. The kind of familiarity that only came from repetition, from a bond built over more than one visit. "Radar," she said, testing the word like she already knew it fit. "No, I didn't know his name. I just call him the dog who won't stop showing up." She tilted her head, studying Caliph the way you'd study a puzzle piece that had landed somewhere it didn't belong. "Though, judging by that jacket, and the fact that you drove up here yourself instead of sending someone, I'm starting to think I should be more careful about who's been finding his way onto my porch." Something in her tone told Caliph she already had a guess about exactly who he was, and that whatever she suspected did not frighten her at all. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Caliph did not know what to say next. He stood there a moment longer than he meant to, listening to wind move through the pines and the soft electronic hum coming from the dish behind her. Everything about this place felt wrong for a man like him. No cameras, no gate, no way to control the room. And yet nothing about it felt dangerous either. That contradiction unsettled him most. "Calith," he finally said, since there didn't seem to be any point pretending otherwise. "And you are?" "Tevin." She didn't offer a hand, just kept watching him the way someone watches weather rolling in over a ridge. "This is the third time this month he's shown up here at midnight. Every time, I've had to guess whether I was about to get an angry phone call or an angry man standing exactly where you're standing now." Calith looked down at Radar, tail thumping, entirely unbothered by the tension between the two humans above him. 3 broken fence lines, 3 sleepless nights chasing a blinking dot across a map, and the dog had led him, every time, to this same stranger in this same clearing. "I don't know," Calith admitted, and the words felt foreign leaving his mouth. He was not a man who said, "I don't know." He paid people specifically so he never had to. "That's why I came myself." Tevin rose, wiping her hands on her jacket, glancing at the tracker still glowing on his phone. "Whatever he's after up here, it isn't me. I've got nothing worth stealing except spare cable and an internet connection that shouldn't exist this far off the grid." It was a small detail, tossed out almost carelessly, but Calith's mind caught on it instantly. A dish angled toward the sky at midnight. A woman living alone, 8 miles from the nearest paved road, running equipment far too advanced for a mountain cabin. He didn't say what he was thinking. Not yet. He crouched and let Radar press his head into his palm, the dog sighing with relief the way he always did once Calith finally arrived. "Good boy," he murmured, eyes still fixed on the dish, and on the calm, unreadable expression Tevin wore like armor. "I'll be back," he said, standing. Tevin almost smiled. "I had a feeling you'd say that." Behind her, the dish gave a faint, rhythmic click, searching for a signal in the dark, and for reasons Calith couldn't yet explain, the sound of it followed him the entire way down the mountain. 2 days later, Calith was still thinking about the dish. He hadn't told anyone about the cabin, not his security chief, not his assistant, not even Varric, his CTO, who normally knew about every anomaly on the estate before Calith himself did. Something about the woman on the porch had made him want to hold the information close, like a card he wasn't ready to play. Then, on Wednesday afternoon, the decision was made for him. He was 3 floors underground in the company's private data center, reviewing quarterly infrastructure reports, when Varric appeared in the doorway without knocking, something he never did. Varric was a tall, precise man who moved like every gesture had been rehearsed for a boardroom camera, and the tightness in his jaw told Calith this wasn't good news. "We have a problem," Varric said, sliding a tablet across the desk. "An unregistered radio signal has been pinging our subterranean fiber corridor for the last 6 hours. It's not strong enough to be a coincidence, and it's coming from a fixed location in the mountains." Calith's stomach tightened before his mind had even caught up to why. "Show me the coordinates." Varric tapped the screen, and a small red marker bloomed over a topographic map of the Bernese Oberland, a marker sitting almost exactly where a wood-framed cabin had glowed amber against the dark 2 nights ago. "Our fiber line runs private encrypted data for every major client contract we hold," Varric continued, his voice sharpening with the kind of controlled urgency he used when he wanted Calith to feel cornered into agreeing with him. "If someone up there is probing it, we're looking at industrial espionage, possibly a rival firm testing our defenses. I've already got a security team ready to move on the location tonight." "No," Calith said, faster than he meant to. Varric blinked. "No? I'll handle it myself." It wasn't a decision that made sense from a business standpoint, and Calith knew it. A man in his position did not personally chase down suspected corporate spies. He sent people whose entire job was absorbing that kind of risk, so he never had to. But some instinct beneath the logic told him this wasn't espionage. It was Tevin's dish. Her signal. Her mountain. And if there was an explanation, he wanted to hear it from her, not from Varek's security report. Varek's jaw tightened further, but he didn't argue. He rarely did, at least not to Caleth's face. "As you wish," he said, in a tone that suggested the opposite. Tevin's workshop sat at the edge of the valley town below the ridge, a converted stone barn strung with antennas and solar panels that made it look like something between a garage and a small observatory. Caleth parked outside without calling ahead, still riding the same current of urgency that had pulled him out of bed 2 nights earlier. He found her inside, elbow deep in the guts of an old transmitter, sleeves rolled up, a headlamp pushed back on her forehead. She looked up when the door swung open and didn't seem remotely surprised to see him. "Twice in 3 days," she said. "People are going to talk." "Your equipment has been pinging my company's private fiber line," Caleth said, skipping past pleasantries entirely. He set his phone on the workbench, the coordinates from Varek's report glowing on the screen. "That's not a coincidence. That's a signature match to this location." Tevin wiped her hands on a rag and glanced at the screen without any visible alarm. The same maddening calm she'd worn on her porch. The calm of someone who had already anticipated this exact conversation. "It's not espionage, if that's what your security team is telling you," she said. "It's overflow." Overflow. "My relay runs on an open frequency band, a network built for exactly this kind of terrain. Search and rescue crews, off-grid clinics, mountain guides who lose cell signal the second they cross a ridge. It's called mesh relief. It's not secret, it's not encrypted, and it's definitely not designed to hack anything." She crossed to a shelf, pulled down a battered folder, and dropped it in front of him. Schematics, frequency logs, a printed license from the Swiss Federal Communications Authority, all dated years back. "Your fiber corridor runs directly beneath the ridge my dish is aimed at. When my signal bounces off the rock the way signals do up here, it grazes your line. That's not me spying on you. That's your engineers not accounting for terrain when they buried a private cable under a public mountain." Caleth flipped through the folder slower than he needed to, partly to verify what she was telling him, and partly because something about watching her lay it all out, unbothered, unafraid, utterly certain of her own ground, was doing something strange to the careful control he usually kept over every room he walked into. He was used to people either flattering him or fearing him. Tevin did neither. She simply handed him facts and let him catch up on his own. "You could have told me this on the porch," he said finally. "You could have asked instead of accusing," Tevin shot back, though there was no real heat in it, more amusement than anger, like she found the whole spectacle of a powerful man storming into her workshop mildly entertaining. "For a man who owns half the fiber under this valley, you spent an awful lot of energy assuming the worst about one radio engineer and a dog." Caleth closed the folder. Somewhere behind the workshop's back door, faintly, he could hear Radar's claws clicking against the stone floor. The dog had followed him inside without being asked, already curling up near Tevin's workbench like he belonged there. That was the part that unsettled Caleth most of all. Not the signal, not the mistaken accusation. It was how instantly, how completely, his own dog had chosen a side. He should have left it there, apologized, thanked her, driven back down the mountain and let Varek sort out the fiber corridor with an engineering fix instead of an armed team. That would have been the sensible thing, the version of this story that ended quietly. But as he gathered the folder to hand back to her, one line on the license caught his eye. The frequency band was scheduled for renewal review by the regional authority next month. The same authority his company had significant influence over. A thought he didn't like formed at the back of his mind, quiet and unwelcome, that somewhere in his own organization, someone already knew exactly what mesh relief was and had sent him up this mountain anyway. The boardroom on the 40th floor had a view built to make people feel small, floor-to-ceiling glass, the whole city laid out beneath it like something Caleth owned outright. Normally he liked that feeling. This morning, it just made him restless. 12 executives sat around the long table, coffee going cold in front of most of them, while Varek stood at the head of the room with a laser pointer trained on a rendering that filled the wall screen. Sleek grey buildings, rows of cooling towers, a sprawling footprint carved into green hillside. Project Summit, Varric announced, in the same rehearsed cadence he used for every major pitch. A next-generation server farm built to secure our cloud infrastructure for the next 20 years. Full construction begins next quarter, pending board approval. He clicked forward. Site selection has been finalized, the Bernese Valley Corridor, Sector 14. Calith went still. He didn't need the coordinates spelled out. He already knew, with a sick, sinking certainty, exactly whose land sat inside that rendering. The stone workshop, the ridge, the cabin with the amber window. Tevin's whole valley, reduced to a shaded polygon on a slide. That corridor is inhabited, Calith said. Varric didn't miss a beat. Sparsely, a handful of rural properties, easily bought out at above-market rates. Our legal team has already drafted the offers. And the radio network operating out of there? For the first time, something flickered across Varric's face. Brief, controlled, gone almost before Calith could be certain he'd seen it. A minor local operation, irrelevant to the build. Once construction begins, the frequency interference from our cooling systems and server load will render it non-functional, regardless of whether the operator agrees to sell. He said it so smoothly, so casually, that half the table nodded along without registering what he'd just admitted. That the project wouldn't just ignore Tevin's network, it would drown it. Calith opened his mouth to press further, and that was when the boardroom doors opened without a knock. Tevin walked in first, still in her work jacket, a folder under one arm, the same folder she'd shown him days earlier, except thicker now, reinforced with more documents. Behind her came a broad-shouldered man in a windbreaker with a regional search and rescue patch stitched to the sleeve, introduced a moment later as Bryn, the Valley's search director. The room went silent, in the particular way rooms go silent when something has gone wrong with the choreography. "You'll forgive the interruption," Tevin said, not sounding sorry at all. "But when a company starts drafting buyout offers for land my equipment sits on, I tend to find out about it before the ink dries." Varric's composure cracked half a degree. "This is a private board meeting. And this is public safety infrastructure you're planning to bulldoze," Bryn cut in, his voice low and steady, the voice of a man used to giving directions in emergencies rather than pitch meetings. "Mesh relief isn't a hobby project. Over the last 3 years, it's helped locate 11 stranded hikers, 2 overdue climbing parties, and 1 missing person in a whiteout. If you kill that relay to build a server farm, the next person we lose won't be a statistic on a slide. It'll be a name." Calith felt the room's attention swing toward him, waiting to see which way he'd move. "Sector 14 was cleared by the property acquisition team," Varric said quickly, addressing the table rather than Calith directly now, a subtle repositioning Calith recognized from 100 negotiations. Appeal to the room when you're losing the room's owner. There's no obligation to halt a fully compliant, fully funded infrastructure project because of one unlicensed. "It's licensed," Tevin said, dropping the folder onto the table so it slid the length of polished wood and stopped directly in front of Varric. "Federally registered, renewed annually, on file with the same regional authority your legal team supposedly checked before drafting those offers." She looked at him without blinking. "Unless they didn't check, or unless someone told them not to." The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable, and Calith watched something pass between Tevin and Varric. Not recognition exactly, but the particular tension of 2 people who had each just confirmed something they'd suspected about the other. Calith thought about the license renewal date he'd noticed in her workshop, about how quickly, how thoroughly, Varric had dismissed a network capable of pinging their fiber line from 8 miles away. About a man who never came to a meeting unprepared, somehow arriving unprepared for exactly the one detail that mattered most. He stood. Every head at the table turned. "We're pausing the project," Calith said. The words landed like a dropped glass, too loud in a room built for careful diplomacy, too final to walk back. Varric's jaw tightened, the same way it had in the data center 3 days earlier. "Calith, the shareholders, will be informed that leadership is conducting due diligence before committing capital to a site with unresolved public safety implications," Calith said, cutting him off with the flat, immovable tone he usually reserved for hostile acquisitions, never for his own people. Full review. Independent audit of the acquisition team's findings. Nothing moves until I have answers. He didn't look at Tevin as he said it, though he was aware, in a way he didn't fully understand yet, that he wanted her to hear it exactly as clearly as everyone else in the room. Varric said nothing more. He simply gathered his papers with hands that were, for the first time since Caliph had known him, not entirely steady, and behind that careful stillness, Caliph caught the unmistakable flicker of a man recalculating. As the room emptied, Tevin lingered by the door, watching the executives file past her without a word of thanks or acknowledgement, as though she'd already learned not to expect either from men like these. Caliph crossed the room to her, aware of how strange it felt to want someone's approval after winning. "That wasn't for you," he said, which was a lie, and they both knew it. Sure it wasn't. She almost smiled again, that small, unreadable curve she seemed to keep in reserve just for him. "You've got a funny way of showing gratitude for a woman who accused you of trespassing 3 days ago. Consider it a work in progress." Bryn, waiting near the elevators, called back over his shoulder without turning around. "Save the flirting for the mountain. Some of us have a search team to brief." Tevin's ears went faintly pink, and for once she had nothing to say at all, a small, satisfying victory Caliph intended to remember for a long time. But as the elevator doors closed behind them, Caliph's satisfaction curdled into something colder. Varric had known. Not suspected, known, and buried it anyway, confident enough in his own control over the acquisition team that he hadn't bothered covering his tracks any better than a single missing license check. Which meant one uncomfortable question was still sitting, unanswered, at the center of everything. If Varric was willing to erase an entire emergency network to build one server farm, how far was he willing to go now that Caliph had stopped him in front of the whole board? 3 days after the boardroom, Caliph found himself back on the gravel track leading up to the cabin, except this time he'd been invited. "If you're going to keep interrogating my equipment," Tevin had told him over the phone in a tone that made it hard to tell whether she was annoyed or amused, "you might as well see how it actually works instead of accusing it of things at a distance." He told himself the trip was strategic. He needed to understand mesh relief well enough to defend it properly through the independent audit, to make sure Varric's team had nowhere left to hide their next objection. That was the story he repeated to himself the entire drive up, right until the moment he stepped out of the SUV and Radar came barreling across the clearing to meet him, nearly knocking him off his feet with sheer joy, and the strategic explanation stopped feeling like the whole truth. The sun was low over the ridgeline, throwing long gold light across the cabin and the pines behind it. And for the first time since this had all started, the place didn't feel like a problem to be solved. It felt, oddly, like somewhere he wanted to be. Tevin met him on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee, handed him one without asking if he wanted it, and gestured for him to follow her toward the dish. She walked him through the relay system with the patient thoroughness of someone who genuinely loved the work. How the antennas caught signal across dead zones, how the mesh network passed messages hand to hand across the valley the way people used to pass buckets at a fire. How a single dropped node could mean the difference between a rescue team finding someone in an hour or finding them a day too late. Caliph listened more carefully than he listened to most quarterly earnings calls. They were halfway through her explanation of the backup battery array when Radar, who had been lying contentedly at their feet, suddenly lifted his head. His ears went rigid. A low sound built in his chest. Not the relaxed, tail-wagging alertness Caliph knew from 100 walks together, but something tighter, more insistent. He stood, paced 2 steps toward the tree line behind the cabin, then looked back at Caliph with an expression that, if a dog could demand something, was demanding. "He does that," Tevin said, watching. "Every time he shows up here. I always figured he just liked the smell of the woods." But Caliph knew Radar's behavior too well to dismiss it that easily. This wasn't curiosity. This was the same posture he used on the estate when he flagged a fence breach before the sensors even registered it. Focused, urgent, purposeful. "Show me," Calith said, more to the dog than to Tevin, and Radar took off at a trot into the brush behind the cabin. They followed him through undergrowth thick with fallen pine needles, the light dimming fast now as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Radar led them roughly 60 yards from the cabin to a rusted metal box, half swallowed by ferns, mounted on a concrete pad that looked decades older than anything else on the property. He planted himself in front of it and began to bark, sharp, repeated, the bark Calith had only ever heard him use once before. The night a fire had started in the estate's generator room, and Radar had woken the entire house before the smoke alarms caught up. "What is that?" Calith asked, already knowing from the dog's reaction that the answer mattered. Tevin crouched beside the box, running her flashlight over a faded utility company logo and a service panel that had rusted half open. "Old high-voltage transformer. It used to service a logging operation up here decades ago, before the company that ran it went under. I always assumed it was decommissioned." She frowned, pulling a small handheld meter from her jacket pocket, the same kind she used to check her own equipment for interference, and held it near the seams of the box. The needle jumped hard, well past any safe reading. "It's not decommissioned," she said quietly. "It's leaking. Electromagnetic radiation, probably from a cracked casing or degraded shielding, bleeding out low-frequency interference into the whole area. This close, prolonged exposure isn't good for a person, and it's definitely not good for a dog who spends half his life with his nose pressed against the ground." She looked up at Calith, and for the first time since he'd met her, the calm confidence in her expression had cracked into something closer to alarm. "This has probably been leaking for months, maybe longer." Calith looked at Radar, who was still standing guard in front of the box, refusing to back away even now that the humans had finally caught up. Every assumption Calith had carried since that first midnight chime rearranged itself at once. He'd told himself Radar was slipping the estate's security out of restlessness, or stubbornness, or some strange, inexplicable pull toward a stranger's cabin. He'd built an entire narrative around a dog chasing a woman. But Radar hadn't been running toward Tevin at all. He'd been running toward a hazard buried in the ground that every human on this mountain, including the woman who lived closest to it, had completely missed. And the only reason anyone was standing here now, staring at a cracked, leaking transformer instead of walking past it for another 6 months, was because a Doberman had refused to stop escaping until somebody finally listened. "He wasn't rebelling," Calith said slowly, almost to himself. "He was warning us." Tevin straightened, tucking the meter back into her pocket, though her eyes stayed on the rusted seams of the box a moment longer, as if recalculating every walk she'd ever taken past it without a second thought. "I need to get this reported and fenced off tonight. If the readings are this high at 60 yards, I don't want to know what they look like at the source." She glanced at him, something new in her expression, not quite gratitude, but close to it. "You should probably thank your dog for noticing what 3 years of me living up here never did." Calith crouched down and pressed his forehead briefly against Radar's, the closest thing to an apology and a thank you he knew how to give an animal who couldn't understand either word. Radar leaned into it, tail finally slowing from its urgent brush against the ferns, satisfied now that the humans had caught up to what he'd known for weeks. Walking back toward the cabin in the last of the dying light, Calith found himself thinking less about the transformer and more about how wrong he'd been from the very first night. Not just about the danger, but about the shape of the whole story. He'd arrived at this valley assuming he understood the threat. A stranger, a signal, a rival's espionage, a woman with something to hide. Every time, the truth had turned out to be simpler and more honest than his suspicion, and every time, it was Radar who'd known it first. It made him wonder, uneasily, what else he might be getting wrong back in Zurich, and how much longer it would take him to catch up to that truth, the way he'd finally caught up to this one. 4 days after the transformer, the independent audit landed on Calith's desk, and it confirmed everything he'd already begun to suspect. The property acquisition team hadn't simply overlooked Mesh Relief's license. They'd flagged it internally, weeks earlier, and the flag had been overridden by a signature that traced directly back to Varek's office. Not an oversight, a decision. Calith read the report twice, then called a private meeting with Varek that never happened. because Varric was suddenly, conveniently, unreachable, traveling for supplier negotiations, according to his assistant, though nobody could say exactly where. Calith didn't like that. He liked it even less when, 2 nights later, his phone rang at 11:40, and it was Tevin's voice on the other end, tighter and faster than he'd ever heard it. "My relay just dropped," she said. "All of it. Every node in the valley, gone at once." "That's not possible," Calith said, already reaching for his jacket. "You run on independent battery backup, specifically so a single point of failure can't." "I know how my own system works," Tevin snapped, and he could hear an engine running behind her, gravel crunching under fast footsteps. "This isn't a technical failure. Someone cut power to the relay station at the source. I'm heading there now." "Don't go alone." "I don't have a choice. Bryn's team has 3 overdue hikers on the eastern ridge tonight, and if this network stays dark, they're navigating blind." A pause, sharper than the rest. "Calith, whoever did this knew exactly which line to cut. This wasn't random." He was already moving before she finished the sentence, keys in hand, radar at his heels, sensing the urgency before Calith had said a single word aloud. The valley's small power substation sat at the base of the ridge, a squat concrete building fenced in chain link, feeding electricity to a handful of remote properties, including Tevin's relay tower. When Calith's headlights swept across the access road, he saw 2 things at once. Tevin's truck pulled crooked against the fence, door hanging open, and a second vehicle he didn't recognize, unmarked, parked deliberately in the shadow of the transformer shed where the perimeter lights didn't reach. He heard raised voices before he was fully out of the car. Tevin stood at the substation's main panel, flashlight in one hand, facing down 2 men in generic utility jackets who wore no company insignia at all. A detail that told Calith everything before either of them opened their mouths. "This is scheduled maintenance," one of them was saying, already backing toward the panel again. "You need to clear the area." "There's no maintenance ticket on file," Tevin shot back. "I checked before I drove up here. You cut the relay feed manually, not through the grid controller, which means you didn't want a record of what you were doing." Calith stepped into the light, radar a low growl beside him, and the 2 men froze. "I run this valley's infrastructure contracts," Calith said, his voice carrying the particular stillness he usually reserved for the moment right before he ended someone's career. "Whose crew are you?" Neither man answered. One of them made the mistake of glancing toward the second vehicle, toward a name barely visible on a clipboard left on the dashboard, a subcontractor Calith recognized instantly because his own company had used them twice, both times on projects Varric had personally overseen. That was answer enough. "Get off this property," Calith said, "now, before I have you arrested for tampering with public safety equipment, which, given the hikers currently lost on that ridge, is not a threat I'm making lightly." Whatever these men were being paid, it clearly wasn't enough to argue with a furious billionaire and an increasingly agitated Doberman at midnight. They left without another word, tires spitting gravel as they peeled out down the access road. Tevin was already back at the panel, hands moving fast over the manual switches, muttering to herself in a mix of German and frustration. They cut the feed line clean, not damaged, cut. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing and didn't want to leave a mess behind. She found the severed junction, swore under her breath, and turned to Calith. "I can splice this and get partial power back, but I need another set of hands holding the line steady while I work, and I need it in the next 4 minutes before my backup batteries run out entirely." Calith didn't hesitate. He knelt in the dirt beside her, holding the exposed cable exactly where she told him, feeling the tremor in his own hands that had nothing to do with the cold. Radar paced a tight, protective circle around them both, ears up, watching the access road for any sign of the men returning. "Almost," Tevin muttered, twisting wire with practiced fingers. "Almost." The relay tower's light, visible through the fence and up the hillside, flickered once, twice, then steadied into a solid, unbroken glow. Tevin exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for the last 10 minutes. "We're back." Calith looked at the restored light, then at her, streaked with dirt and sweat in the beam of her flashlight, and felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with infrastructure at all. "That crew," he said quietly. "I recognized the subcontractor. My company hired them. Twice." Tevin went still, understanding landing on her face exactly as it had landed on his. "Varric." "Varric," Calith confirmed, and the anger that moved through him now was colder and far more dangerous than anything he'd felt in the boardroom. Varric hadn't just buried a license check. He had sent men into the dark to cut power to a system that stranded hikers depended on to survive, a decision made not out of ignorance, but out of pure, calculated defiance of the order Calith had given in front of the entire board. Somewhere on the ridge above them, 3 lost hikers had just gotten their signal back, and somewhere back in Zurich, Varric had just made himself an enemy Calith would not forgive twice. Calith woke on the 18th day to a voicemail from Tevin that made his stomach drop for the second time in 3 weeks. "They took my transmitters," she said, her voice clipped with barely controlled fury. "Municipal inspectors showed up at dawn with a court order, said my equipment violated a broadcast safety code nobody's enforced in a decade, and impounded everything, the emergency units, the backup relays, all of it. It's sitting in a warehouse in Lucerne right now, and without it, mesh relief is gone until someone releases the hold. Call me back." He called back before he'd even gotten out of bed. "Walk me through exactly what happened," he said, already pulling up his legal team's direct line on a second screen. Tevin's account, once she'd calmed enough to lay it out in order, was precise and damning. The inspectors hadn't come from the Regional Communications Authority, the body that actually regulated her license. They'd come from a municipal transit and infrastructure office, invoking an obscure safety code meant for commercial broadcast towers near airports. A code that had no legitimate application to a mountain relay 8 miles from the nearest runway. The court order authorizing the seizure had been filed and approved within 18 hours, a timeline Calith's own legal counsel later confirmed was, in his words, aggressively unusual for anything moving through that office. "It's Varric," Tevin said flatly. "He can't touch the license directly. The federal authority already backed me on that. So he's going after the hardware instead, through a bureaucratic side door nobody bothers checking." Calith didn't argue. He'd stopped needing convincing days ago. "Give me 2 hours," he said. The Lucerne Transit Hub's impound warehouse was a grey, featureless building near the freight yards, the kind of place designed to be forgettable, which was exactly why it made an effective hiding spot for equipment someone wanted buried in red tape. Calith arrived with 2 lawyers, a logistics director, and a printed folder of his own, not Tevin's evidence this time, but everything his legal team had assembled overnight about the municipal office's jurisdiction, the misapplied safety code, and a formal federal complaint already drafted and ready to file. The warehouse manager, a tired man in his 50s, who clearly hadn't been told whose equipment he was sitting on, blinked twice when Calith introduced himself and slid a business card across the counter. "I need to see the seizure paperwork," Calith said, "and I need to know exactly who authorized the transit office's jurisdiction over broadcast equipment, because as far as I can tell, they don't have any." It took 40 minutes of phone calls, 3 raised voices, and 1 increasingly uncomfortable district supervisor pulled out of a meeting to review the order himself, before the manager finally admitted, quietly, that the paperwork did seem unusually thin for a seizure of this scale. Calith's lawyers made quick work of the rest, a formal challenge, a threatened federal complaint naming both the municipal office and, implicitly, whoever had pressured them into acting, and a not-so-subtle reminder that Calith's company held contracts with half the infrastructure projects that office depended on for funding. By early afternoon, the hold was lifted. Calith personally supervised the loading of Tevin's equipment, the transmitters, the backup relays, the delicate directional antennas wrapped in protective foam, into his own company's logistics truck, the same fleet normally reserved for moving server hardware across 3 countries. He rode with the truck himself, refusing his driver's offer to take the wheel, some part of him needing to see the equipment safely back on the mountain with his own eyes. Tevin was waiting in the clearing when the truck pulled up, arms crossed, radar sitting alert beside her like he'd known exactly when to expect them. She watched the crew unload crate after crate onto her porch, and when the last one was set down, she turned to Caliph with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not the guarded amusement, not the sharp-edged suspicion, but something quieter and more unguarded underneath both. "You didn't have to come yourself," she said. "You could have sent the truck." "I know. So why did you?" Caliph looked at the equipment stacked on her porch, at the dish already catching the lust of the afternoon light, at Radar leaning contentedly against her leg, like this clearing had become as much his home as the Zurich estate ever was. "Because Varric didn't just try to seize hardware today," he said. "He tried to prove a point, that he can reach further than I can, faster than I can, even after I stopped him in front of the entire board. I wasn't going to let that stand behind a phone call." Tevin studied him for a long moment, the wind moving through the pines behind her, and something in her posture finally eased, the way a person's shoulders drop when they stop bracing for a blow that never lands. "For a corporate boss," she said, "you're turning out to be a surprisingly stubborn ally." "For a woman who accused me of trespassing," Caliph said, "you're turning out to be worth the trouble." She almost laughed, the first real laugh he'd heard from her, short and startled, like it had escaped before she'd decided to allow it. But as the sound faded, her expression sobered again, and she looked past him, toward the road winding back down into the valley. "He's not going to stop," she said quietly. "Not after this. Men like Varric don't lose twice and walk away." Caliph knew she was right. He'd built his career reading exactly this kind of man, and everything about the seizure, quiet, deniable, routed through a side door instead of a direct confrontation, told him Varric was regrouping, not retreating. Whatever came next, Caliph understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity, would not be another quiet, bureaucratic trick. It would be something bigger, and it would be aimed at more than just her equipment. The fog rolled in without warning, the way mountain weather always seemed to, turning a clear morning hike into a whiteout in under 20 minutes. Caliph was at the cabin when the call came through, a rare, quiet morning with no board meetings, no legal filings, just coffee on the porch with Tevin while Radar chased something invisible through the ferns. Her radio crackled to life before either of them had finished their first cup. "Base, this is Bryn. Do you copy?" His voice was tight, clipped with the particular urgency of a man trained not to sound panicked, even when he was. "We've got 4 hikers overdue on the High Ridge Trail, last check-in 90 minutes ago, and this fog just dropped visibility to nothing. My team's moving in, but we're navigating half-blind up there. I need eyes on the dead zone by the eastern outcrop." Tevin was already on her feet, radio in hand. "Copy that, Bryn. What's your relay status?" "That's the problem." A burst of static swallowed half his next sentence. "The eastern outcrop sits in a total signal gap. Always has. It's the one stretch your network's never fully covered. My team loses contact with base the second they cross it, and that's exactly where the hiker's last ping came from." Caliph watched Tevin's face change, the shift from concern to focus, the particular stillness of someone running through a mental map faster than most people could read one. "I can cover it," she said, "but I'll need a mobile relay set up directly on the ridge, not down here. My dish can't punch through that rock face from this distance." "Then let's go," Caliph said, already reaching for his jacket. Tevin didn't argue, which told him more than any words could have about how serious the situation was. Within 10 minutes, they'd loaded a directional antenna, a portable battery pack, and a folding relay unit into the back of Caliph's SUV, Radar leaping in after them without being asked, ears already pricked toward the mountain like he understood exactly what was at stake. The drive up the access road was slower than either of them wanted, fog thickening with every switchback until the headlights barely cut 10 feet ahead. By the time they reached the trailhead and began the climb toward the eastern outcrop on foot, visibility had dropped to almost nothing, grey walls of mist pressing in from every direction, the kind of fog that swallowed sound as easily as sight. "Stay close," Tevin said, voice low, checking her compass rather than trusting her eyes. "People die in this stuff, not because they're far from help, but because they're 20 feet from the trail and can't tell which direction it's in." Radar moved ahead of them with a confidence neither human could match, nose low, weaving through the fog like he was reading a map painted in scent that only he could see. Caliph had trusted the dog's instincts once already on this mountain, and he trusted them now, following Radar's lead up a narrow, rocky path that clung to the outcrop's edge. They reached the ridge just as Tevin's handheld unit crackled with a fractured burst of Bryn's voice, barely readable through the static. "Can't. Visual on the. Repeat. Need." "That's the dead zone talking," Tevin muttered, already unfolding the portable relay and angling the directional antenna toward the rock face above them. "Caliph, hold this steady, exactly like this. Don't let it drift." She crouched beside the battery pack, hands moving fast, cold, numbed fingers fumbling only once before steadying. "If I can bounce a signal off that outcrop instead of trying to punch straight through it, we might get enough of a window to guide them in." Caliph held the antenna exactly as instructed, arms burning within minutes from the strain of keeping it motionless in the wind, fog beading cold against his face. Radar planted himself at the ridge's edge, alert and still, occasionally lifting his head toward a sound neither human could yet hear. "Come on," Tevin whispered, adjusting a dial with painstaking precision. "Come on." The static cleared, just slightly, enough for Bryn's voice to cut through, ragged with relief. "Base, I have you. Barely. Say again, do you have eyes on the hikers?" "Negative, but I can guide your team," Tevin said into the radio, her voice suddenly calm and commanding in a way Caliph hadn't heard from her before. The voice of someone who had done this exact thing more times than she'd probably ever mentioned. "Your GPS ping puts you 80 meters northwest of the outcrop's base. Hiker's last signal was a further 200 meters beyond that, in the direction of the old shepherd's shelter. Head northwest, keep the outcrop on your right shoulder, and you'll walk straight into the fog line where they lost contact." There was a long, terrible silence, filled only with wind and static and the sound of Caliph's own heartbeat. Then, "Copy that. Moving now." 12 minutes passed like 12 hours. Caliph's arms had gone numb from holding the antenna steady, and still he didn't move, watching Tevin's face for any flicker of doubt she refused to show. Radar had gone utterly silent, ears forward, as though he too were listening for a signal only he could catch. Finally, the radio crackled again. "Base, this is Bryn." His voice cracked, not from static this time, but from something rawer. "We've got them. All four, cold and scared, but alive. We've got them." Tevin's shoulders dropped in a single long exhale, and for a moment she simply knelt there in the fog, one hand resting on the relay unit, the other finding Radar's head without looking, grounding herself in the solid warmth of the dog who'd led them exactly where they needed to be. Caliph lowered the antenna at last, arms shaking, and looked at her, soaked, freezing, utterly unglamorous, and somehow the most impressive person he had ever stood beside. "You just saved 4 lives with a folding antenna and a compass," he said quietly. Tevin managed a tired, disbelieving laugh. "We did," she corrected. "All 3 of us." Radar, as if he understood exactly what she meant, thumped his tail once against the wet stone. The rescue made local news within a day, and by the 3rd day, it had reached the kind of publications Caliph's board actually read. A mountain relay operator credited with saving 4 stranded hikers, working alongside emergency crews on equipment that, until recently, had nearly been seized by a company few reporters realized was Caliph's own. He hadn't leaked the story. He hadn't needed to. Bryn's official rescue report did the work for him, and it named names. It also, quietly and devastatingly, exposed the paper trail Caliph had spent 3 days assembling. He'd gone back through everything after the substation sabotage, the falsified maintenance schedule, the subcontractor invoices routed through a shell account, the municipal seizure order traced to a single anonymous tip that Caliph's legal team eventually linked, through phone records his security chief obtained with uncomfortable ease, to a burner number registered the same week Varric had presented Project Summit to the board. It wasn't circumstantial anymore. It was a pattern, documented start to finish, and Caliph had built his career reading exactly this kind of file. He called the emergency board meeting himself, not through his assistant, and made certain Varric received the notice with no explanation attached. The 40th floor boardroom felt different this time. The same glass, the same skyline, but the air inside it had shifted, the way a room changes the moment everyone in it senses something is about to break. Varric arrived precisely on time, composed as ever, though Calith noticed the slight stiffness in his shoulders, the too careful way he set his tablet down on the table, like a man rehearsing calm rather than feeling it. "You called this meeting without an agenda," Varric said, taking his usual seat. "I assume there's a reason." "There is." Calith didn't sit. He remained standing at the head of the table, the folder in his hand thicker now than the one Tevin had once slid across this same surface. 3 weeks ago, this board approved due diligence on Project Summit after concerns were raised about an emergency communications network operating in the proposed build site. I want to share what that diligence found. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply began reading. The overridden license flag, dated and signed. The falsified maintenance order at the substation, cross-referenced with the subcontractor's dispatch logs from that exact night. The municipal seizure traced back to an anonymous tip filed the same week Varric's project timeline required mesh relief gone. The burner phone, purchased in cash, registered under a name that led, through 3 careful steps, back to an account only Varric had access to. By the time Calith set the folder down, nobody at the table was looking at him anymore. Every eye had shifted to Varric. "This is circumstantial," Varric said, but his voice had lost its usual polish, the careful cadence cracking at the edges. "None of this proves. It proves a pattern of deliberate sabotage against public safety infrastructure," Calith said, "carried out by this company's chief technology officer in direct defiance of a board-approved pause on the project he was trying to protect. 4 hikers were rescued 12 days ago using a network you tried 3 separate times to destroy. If that relay had gone dark permanently, this board would currently be discussing a wrongful death lawsuit instead of a corporate governance failure." The silence that followed was absolute. Varric's composure finally slipped entirely, something raw and cornered flashing across his face before he caught himself. "I did what was necessary to protect a billion-franc infrastructure investment. You were compromised the moment that woman walked into this room. You stopped thinking like a businessman and started thinking like—" He caught himself too late. "Like what?" Calith said quietly, and the question landed harder than any accusation could have. Varric didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood exactly what he'd been about to say, and the fact that he'd said it at all, that he'd revealed, in front of the entire board, that his real objection had never been about infrastructure at all, but about a threat to his own influence over Calith, told Calith everything he needed to know. "Effective immediately," Calith said. "Your contract is terminated. Corporate access revoked as of this meeting. Legal will be in touch regarding the sabotage findings, and I'd strongly recommend you cooperate, because the alternative is a criminal referral rather than a civil one." Varric looked around the table for support and found none. The same executives who had nodded along with Project Summit 3 weeks earlier now avoided his eyes entirely. The particular cowardice of people who had quietly known something was wrong and said nothing until it was safe to. He stood, gathered his tablet with hands that shook this time in a way he couldn't disguise, and walked out without another word. The boardroom doors closed behind him with a soft, final click that felt louder than anything either of them had said. Calith exhaled slowly, feeling the adrenaline of the last 3 weeks finally start to drain out of him, replaced by something heavier and more permanent. "Project Summit is cancelled," he told the remaining board members. "Effective today. I'll be restructuring our infrastructure priorities going forward, starting with a full review of how this company evaluates land use in inhabited regions. I won't be building anything else that requires erasing the people already living there." Nobody argued. Nobody dared. As the meeting broke and executives filed out in the particular hush that followed a public execution of someone's career, Calith stood alone at the window, looking out over the city he'd built his empire on, and found himself thinking not about the company, or the shareholders, or the mess Varric had left behind. He was thinking about a cabin 8 miles up a mountain, and how strange it was that the truest thing anyone had shown him in years had started with a dog who wouldn't stop escaping. 5 days after Varick's termination, the storm came in exactly the way Tevin had warned Calith it eventually would, without mercy and without much warning at all. It started as distant thunder rolling over the western peaks around sunset, the kind of sound Calith had learned to respect after a month in this valley. By 9 o'clock, the wind had picked up hard enough to bend the pines around the cabin sideways, and by 10, rain was coming down in sheets so thick the porch light barely reached the tree line. Calith had driven up that afternoon, meaning to stay only a few hours, a quiet dinner, a chance to finally breathe after the chaos of the last month. But the moment the sky turned, Tevin had looked at the radar on her laptop screen and said, flatly, "You're not driving back down in this," and he hadn't argued. They were halfway through securing the loose equipment on her porch when the lights inside the cabin flickered once, twice, and died completely. "Municipal grid's down," Tevin said, already moving for her emergency lantern by feel in the dark. "Storm probably took out a line somewhere lower in the valley. We've got backup batteries, but they're rated for hours, not days, and if this storm sits over the ridge the way the forecast says it will, we're going to need more than what I've got stored." Radar, who had been pacing restlessly near the door for the last 20 minutes, suddenly stiffened and let out a sharp, urgent bark toward the tree line behind the cabin. The same posture, the same unmistakable alarm Calith remembered from the night they'd found the leaking transformer. A flash of white light split the sky, followed almost instantly by a crack of thunder loud enough to rattle the cabin windows. "That was close," Tevin breathed, and then, through the rain-streaked glass, they both saw it. A second flash, brighter and closer than the first, striking directly where the old transformer box sat buried in the ferns. The dish on the roof, already straining against the wind, gave a sharp electronic screech and went dark. "No, no, no!" Tevin was already pulling on her boots, grabbing her flashlight and a toolkit in one motion. "That strike must have hit the shielding we reinforced after radar found it. If it shorted out anything connected to my primary relay line, the whole valley loses emergency frequency, and Bryn's team is coordinating a live response right now. There's a family stranded in a flooded access road 2 miles from here. They radioed in 20 minutes ago." Calith felt the floor of his stomach drop the way it had on that very first midnight chime, weeks ago now. Though this time, the danger wasn't just a runaway dog. It was a woman, a rescue team, and an entire valley's emergency signal going dark in the middle of a storm that showed no sign of slowing. "What do you need?" he said, already pulling on his own jacket. "My mobile satellite rig," Tevin said, thinking fast, eyes scanning the dark cabin like she was assembling a plan in real time. "It's not built for this. It's designed for short-range field relay, not powering a full network. But if I can wire it into my backup generator array instead of the dead grid line, it might be enough to bridge us through until the storm passes." "I have a rig like that," Calith said suddenly. "In the SUV. High capacity, satellite uplink. The same unit my logistics team uses for emergency site coordination when we lose ground signal on remote builds." He was already moving toward the door. "It's built to handle exactly this kind of load." Tevin stared at him for half a second, rain hammering the windows behind her, and something passed across her face that looked almost like disbelief. The particular disbelief of someone who had spent years solving these problems entirely alone, suddenly realizing she didn't have to solve this one that way. "Then let's move," she said. "Fast." They went out into the storm together, radar bolting ahead of them to stand guard at the generator shed, as though he already understood, better than either human, exactly what was at stake. Rain soaked through Calith's jacket within seconds, lightning flashing overhead in jagged white streaks that lit the whole clearing in brief, violent flashes, and somewhere behind them, faintly audible even over the storm, the useless dish continued its dead electronic clicking, searching for a signal that wasn't coming. Calith wrestled the rig out of his SUV, arms straining against its weight and the wind fighting to tear it from his grip, while Tevin worked frantically at the generator shed door, forcing the rusted latch open with a strength that surprised him. "We've got maybe 20 minutes before that family's radio battery dies," she shouted over the wind, hauling cable toward the shed. "After that, we're not guiding anyone to safety. We're just listening to silence and hoping." Calith looked at her, soaked, terrified for people she'd never met, running headlong into a storm most people would have sheltered from, and felt something settle into place that had been building in him for weeks now, something far more certain than any decision he'd made in a boardroom. "Then we'd better not lose those 20 minutes, he said, and followed her into the shed. Behind them, the storm rolled on, indifferent and enormous, lightning splitting the sky over the valley where a stranded family waited in the dark for a signal that 2 people and 1 very determined dog were about to fight the entire night to give them. Inside the shed, Tevin was already on her knees beside the generator, prying open a panel with numb fingers while rain hammered the tin roof above them like gunfire. "I need you to hold the uplink steady against the mounting bracket while I splice the feed," she said, voice raised over the noise, all business now, no room left for fear. "One wrong connection and we fry the whole rig before it ever gets a signal out." Calith braced the heavy unit against the bracket exactly as she asked, muscles already screaming from hauling it through the storm, and watched her hands move with the same steady precision he'd seen at the substation weeks earlier. Except this time, there was no anger driving her, no sabotage to undo. Just a woman doing the only thing she knew how to do when someone else's life depended on it. "Talk to me," he said, needing to hear something over the storm besides his own fear. "How close are we?" "Close," Tevin said through gritted teeth, twisting the last connection into place. "Closer than I want to admit out loud in case I jinx it." Outside, Radar's bark cut through the rain again, sharper this time. Not a warning of danger, Calith realized, but something closer to encouragement, as if the dog understood exactly how much was riding on the next few minutes and had decided, in his own way, to stand watch until it was done. The last connection refused to hold. Tevin had spliced the feed twice already, and twice the current had spiked and died the moment she tried to route it through the generator's overworked regulator, the whole unit groaning under a load it was never built to carry alone. "It's not the wiring," she said, wiping rain and sweat from her eyes with the back of one hand. "It's the regulator. Your rig's pulling more power than my generator can smooth out on its own. I need a second stabilizer in the loop, and I don't have one." Calith's mind raced through everything he'd loaded into the SUV that afternoon, half-formed habits from years of never traveling anywhere unprepared. "The tracker unit," he said suddenly. "The one I used to find radar that first night. It has its own power regulator built in, small, but it's rated for exactly this kind of load balancing. I still have it in the glove box." "That could work," Tevin said, already reaching for her toolkit. "Get it, now." He sprinted back into the storm without hesitating, rain slashing sideways hard enough to sting, and returned less than 2 minutes later soaked to the bone, the small tracker unit clutched against his chest like something far more precious than its size suggested. It was, he realized dimly, the same device that had started this entire story a month ago, the thing that had first led him up this mountain to a stranger's porch. Somehow, it felt right that it would be the thing that finished it. Tevin worked fast, hands steady despite the cold, wiring the tracker's regulator into the loop between the generator and the satellite rig, with the kind of focused calm Calith had come to recognize as her true nature underneath all the sharp edges. Radar pressed close against Calith's legs in the cramped shed, a warm, solid presence in the middle of the chaos, refusing to be anywhere else. "Okay," Tevin breathed, sitting back on her heels. "That's everything I've got. Moment of truth." She flipped the final switch. For a long, agonizing second, nothing happened. Just the storm howling outside, the generator's labored hum, the 2 of them holding their breath together in the dark. Then, slowly, a small green light blinked to life on the satellite rig's display, followed by another, and another, until the unit hummed steady and strong. Tevin grabbed the handheld radio with shaking hands. "Base, this is Tevin, do you copy? Emergency relay restored on backup power. Repeat, relay restored." Static, agonizing and endless filled the shed. Then, breaking through it, clear and unmistakable. "Tevin, this is Bryn. I copy loud and clear, thank God. We've been navigating blind for the last 15 minutes. Do you have a fix on the stranded family's location?" Their last transmission put them at the flooded culvert crossing on the lower access road, Tevin said, already pulling up the coordinates from memory, her voice steadying with every word. Water's rising fast in that section during storms like this. I'd guide your team to approach from the higher embankment rather than the road itself, or you risk getting stranded alongside them. Copy that. Moving now. The wait that followed felt endless, in a way even the fog-bound rescue weeks earlier hadn't, the storm raging on outside as though it resented being denied its victory. Calith sat beside Tevin on the cold shed floor, Radar's head resting heavy across both their laps, and for once, neither of them said anything at all, just listened to the rain and the static and the distant rumble of thunder rolling away toward the far ridges. Nearly 40 minutes later, the radio crackled back to life. Base, this is Bryn. Family secure, 2 adults, wet and cold but unharmed. We've got them moving to shelter now. A pause, then, quieter, almost disbelieving. Tevin, that relay shouldn't have worked tonight. Whatever you two did up there, it worked. Tevin closed her eyes, head tipping back against the shed wall, relief washing visibly through her entire body. Copy, base. Glad to hear it. Get them warm. She set the radio down with hands that finally, fully began to shake, not from cold, Calith understood, but from the release of holding herself together through hours of pure, focused terror. He reached over without thinking and took her hand, and she let him, her fingers cold and trembling against his. You did that, he said quietly. All of it. The rig, the routing, staying calm enough to talk a rescue team through a flood in the dark. That family is alive because you refused to stop, even when the storm gave you every reason to. We did that, Tevin corrected, echoing the words from the ridge weeks earlier, though this time her voice cracked slightly on them. I couldn't have gotten that signal up without your rig, without you sprinting into a lightning storm for a glovebox part like it was nothing. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to loosen its grip, thunder retreating further into the distance with each passing minute, rain softening from a roar to something closer to a steady patter against the tin roof. Radar sighed contentedly between them, worn out from a night of standing guard over 2 humans who had, somewhere in the chaos, stopped being strangers entirely. Calith looked at Tevin in the dim glow of the emergency lantern, exhausted, soaked, utterly unguarded in a way he'd never seen her before, and understood, with a clarity that startled him, that he did not want this to be a story that ended when the storm did. Tevin, he said quietly. She looked up at him, still catching her breath, still holding his hand like she hadn't quite decided to let go. Whatever happens next, he said, I don't want to go back to a life that doesn't include this, include you. For the first time since the night he'd first found her kneeling beside her dish under a midnight sky, Tevin didn't have a sharp answer ready. She simply leaned her head against his shoulder and let the last of the storm pass quietly over both of them. The board took the news better than Calith expected, though by then nothing about him surprised them much anymore. He'd spent the weeks after the storm doing something he'd never once done in 15 years of running his company, stepping back from it, slowly and deliberately, handing off division after division to people who had earned the trust he'd spent most of his career withholding. The formal resignation, when it finally came, took less than 10 minutes in front of a board that had already watched him choose a mountain valley over a server farm once before. Nobody was shocked. A few of them, he suspected, were even relieved. What surprised the financial press far more was what he did next. 6 months after the storm, the cabin no longer looked like a cabin at all, or rather, it still was one, at its heart, but it had grown around itself the way a tree grows around an old fence post, absorbing new structures without losing its original shape. A low, solar-paneled operations building now stood where the ferns behind the cabin used to grow wild, its foundations set carefully around the fenced, permanently decommissioned transformer box that had started everything. A second relay tower rose from the ridge above, taller and sturdier than anything Tevin had built alone, funded not by a corporate infrastructure budget, but by the foundation the two of them had co-founded together in the weeks following the storm. A global emergency communications non-profit, built on the exact principle Mesh Relief had always stood for, now scaled to reach valleys and villages far beyond this one. Calith stood on the porch on a clear autumn morning, coffee in hand, watching a training crew of 6 volunteers practice antenna assembly in the clearing below, the Foundation's first cohort, learning to build relay networks for regions that had never had reliable emergency communication at all. Heaven moved among them, correcting a technique here, adjusting a mounting angle there, the same patient thoroughness she'd once used to walk a stubborn, suspicious billionaire through the basics of signal relay on this very porch. "They're good," she said, joining him with her own mug a few minutes later, watching the volunteers work. "Better than we were, honestly, at this stage." "We didn't have 6 months of funding and a proper training curriculum," Calith said. "We had a leaking transformer and a very determined dog." As if summoned, Radar came trotting up from the tree line, greeting the volunteers with the easy familiarity of an animal who considered the entire operation, cabin and crew alike, unmistakably his. He'd taken to his new role as unofficial site supervisor with an enthusiasm that made the volunteers laugh more than any formal orientation could, and Calith had come to genuinely believe the dog understood, in his own way, exactly what this place had become because of him. "You ever think about it?" Tevin asked, watching Radar flop down in a patch of sun. "How different this would all look if he'd just stayed inside the fence that first night." Calith considered the question seriously, the way he'd learned to consider most things Tevin asked him, rather than answering too quickly. "I think about it constantly," he admitted. "I had 12 cameras, 4 guards, and a fence wired to detect a bird landing on it. None of it could stop him from finding the one thing that actually mattered." He glanced at her. "I used to think that made the security a failure. Now I think it just proves he was smarter than all of it combined." Tevin laughed, the easy, unguarded laugh he'd grown to love more than almost anything else about this life he'd built with her. A laugh that had once been rare and hard-won, and now came far more freely than either of them ever expected. Smarter than a corporate boss and his entire executive team, apparently. "Don't remind me." Below them, one of the volunteers successfully locked a directional antenna into place for the first time, and a ragged, delighted cheer went up from the small group, Bryn among them, having joined the Foundation's advisory board the moment it was formally announced, his rescue expertise now woven directly into how the training curriculum was built. What had started as a single, desperate midnight phone call about lost hikers had become something far larger, a network of networks, each one built on the same simple principle Radar had understood before any of the humans around him had bothered to catch up. Calith set down his coffee and pulled Tevin close against his side, watching the training session below with a contentment he still, even now, found himself faintly surprised to feel. "I used to think I'd spend my whole life protecting things," he said quietly. "Contracts, buildings, a company built to survive anything. I never once thought about what it would feel like to actually build something worth protecting instead." Tevin tipped her head against his shoulder, watching the ridge where her old, solitary dish had once stood alone against the sky, now surrounded by towers, training crews, and a future neither of them had seen coming, the night a Doberman broke through a fence that was never supposed to fail. "He knew," she said softly, watching Radar sprawled contentedly in the sun below them, utterly unbothered by the empire that had rearranged itself entirely around his stubborn, 60-pound sense of purpose. "Somehow, from the very first night, he already knew exactly where you needed to be." Calith looked out over the valley, the relay towers catching morning light, the volunteers laughing over their first successful build, the woman beside him who had never once been afraid of him, and the dog who had refused, again and again, to stop until somebody finally listened. "Good boy," he murmured, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything in his life.